Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on YouTube, you know you can carry the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go on every fine podcast platform that's out there. And if you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can check us out on YouTube as well, and let your friends and your family members know all about it. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment, do all those wonderful social media things that folks do to let everybody they know around them how much they're enjoying the lunch hour. Excited to bring on our guest today. His name is Austen Bannan. He's a policy fellow regarding employment, focusing on employment with Americans for Prosperity. He has a BA from, I want to say Georgia. Now I'm going to say it's Georgia or Georgia State, Austen.
This is University of Georgia, the Bulldogs.
University of Georgia, UGA. Got it. Sorry about that. I know that there's an intense rivalry there. But he's worked up on Capitol Hill. He's worked for a couple of different organizations that are out there. Let's start here with employment policy. How did you wind up getting focused on employment policy?
Yeah, well, I guess we may come to realize everything is employment if you want it to be when it comes to policies, everything that impacts jobs. But it really took a lot of interest in the intersection of where barriers are for the type of living people are trying to have, for their opportunities. And I focus a lot by saying employment on what those barriers look like, something that gets in the way of people advancing in the careers they want and finding the opportunities they want. And it connects down to a personal level. A lot of issues we work on maybe macro level, but there's a certain micro level aspect to employment policy where you can really touch individuals and really see how a policy impacts them. And I got a lot of passion to get into that space and you know, just an opportunity where there's always gaps in knowledge we have, and just pursued it out of interest.
My very, very, very first job was working for a law firm in Washington, D.C. On labor and employment issues, and sort of understanding the push-pull and how the regulatory process impacts things was a real eye-opening experience for me. And you know, to come not full circle, but to come, you know, now almost 3 decades after that, was just talking to somebody about the war. And I hesitate to use those terms, the bellicose terms, but I think it's not overstating it to say that there really is a war on individual employment here nowadays. And more to the point, the freedom to be employed how you want to be employed. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of agreement that from society, regardless of your political affiliations or your point of view, we all look for employment. We want people to live well. But there's a difference of opinion in sort of the pathway to getting there. And what you just brought up, this opportunity to be self-employed, to sort of control your own destiny. America certainly has a lot of people employed by larger businesses and traditional employment, but we increasingly have people in self-employment where they sort of control their own schedules to meet their family needs, whether it's a working mother, whether it's someone with disabilities, or somebody who wants to start a new career and they start out with side gigs. And we have a lot of small businesses that form from that. You know, it's sometimes a small business is just one person, but then it becomes several more. But one thing that kind of comes across, we've experienced with this administration in particular, is there's a lot of goals that they aspire to see in a workplace, and they don't feel that some of those priorities can be met by the self-employed. It's much easier to provide regulatory oversight and sort of have businesses adhere to it if they're larger businesses that can comply with the red tape more easily. And so we've really found that it seems to be an inconvenience for some that people would be in a path of self-employment. There is an argument that maybe they lack benefits or certain positive qualities from traditional employment. And certainly there are positive qualities to traditional employment. But something I brought up before, a lot of times there's barriers. And those barriers actually happen to be certain government policies that get in the way of the few things that are actually negative within self-employment. There are ways you could allow healthcare and other benefits to flow to individuals, like voluntary portable benefits accounts.
It's funny. I'm now, in addition to the media work that I do and the regulatory work that I do, I'm also now chairing or directing the Coalition Against Socialized Medicine, of which AFP, Americans for Prosperity, has been a part. And, I will never forget many, many years ago when I was working on the Affordable Care Act, and I was working on a project called Keeping Small Business Healthy. I had somebody come to an event and talk about decoupling health insurance from employment. And I was relatively new at the time to the issue. I've become much more of an expert on it now, obviously. But this issue of decoupling employment from health insurance, this to me makes so much sense. And obviously we doubled down as a nation with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. But talk about the interplay between the two.
Yeah, well, I guess we're not maybe at quite a century yet, but for nearly a century, there's this notion that built up from the World War II era and Depression that people could get their health care and other benefits through businesses, and incentives were set up to sort of start tying those together. This isn't to say that a business offering benefits to workers is a bad thing. It certainly isn't. But all these disadvantages have built up for those who want to get it independently. But there really is an opportunity when you really look into the space. It isn't a lack of willpower for individuals to try to pursue this, or for businesses to offer benefits to people who aren't traditional employees, or for these workers to group together by industry or independent contractors across a whole state. But there are barriers at the federal and state levels that actually get in the way of that. There's employment tests where you can't offer the things that traditional employees get for self-employed workers. And as noted, because it's not tied to an employer, you really can't create the same kind of health benefits and health insurance options for individuals to pool together in ways other than who they work with as traditional employees. But that's government barriers, and there are solutions if we have enough people to support it.
Well, and that's just it, right? I mean, there's on some level, the left and the statists, they poo-poo Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged as some kind of, well, listen, they call it fascistic, which of course it is not. And I don't claim to be an objectivist. I don't particularly claim to be a Randian. But one of the things that Atlas Shrugged does posit is how government regulations and rules lock people into employment situations that they might not otherwise want to have, because government mandates certain kinds of both business behaviors and therefore individual behaviors. Your thoughts there? Yeah,
it's a situation where we talk about America being a sort of a free market and open economy, and certainly it is compared to a lot of places around the world. But it isn't a situation where worker choice and worker flexibility is dictated by the businesses and their mutual benefit relationships with workers. There are a lot of rules and regulations that govern our contracts, and that over time, again, somebody certainly would prefer a job over lacking a job when they needed to provide for their families. But why can't we have a situation where people can pursue all the different aspects of a career that work well for them? And so if you have rules and regulations about what hours you can work and how you can work, all of a sudden you don't have that flexibility to create your own schedule. A lot of self-employed workers, they could work full-time for periods of time for one particular business, one client. But a lot of them, they want to branch out and say, I can do, doesn't matter if you're a journalist writing or a photographer, or you're a lawyer or a yoga instructor or a musician or a construction worker. There's actually, self-employed workers in every single industry. And a lot of them just like to control their schedule and be their own boss.
100%, man. I have a number of different gigs, as I have alluded to here. I have a couple different media gigs in addition to the policy gigs that I do. And the one thing, it's so funny because I've just taken on a project, a short-term run project that I love, but it is taken away a certain amount of that flexibility because I have to be in a particular place at a particular time every day for a certain amount of time. And giving up that flexibility was a really hard choice. I love the fact that my schedule is my own. I have been very fortunate in that regard for a very long time. In fact, let's use that as a springboard to talk about this idea of, because I don't know, I'm sure you've written about it, but I'm sure you have thoughts on this. the idea of compensation and how compensation gets very complicated. It's not necessarily just about wages, but it's about job satisfaction in terms of what you demand. What are your thoughts here on that, and how it relates to the so-called income pay gap between genders?
Yeah, so you're right. Compensation. A lot of times, the economists, when I pull up data, they're looking at this pure. Here's what somebody makes per hour,
right?
And it doesn't account for the lives we lead and all the different things that we value at a workplace. Somebody might want more time off versus a pay raise. Somebody may instead prefer much higher pay and not having a certain benefit mandated upon them, whether it's a healthcare or other benefits. So a lot of times we're trying to look at the big picture, what leads to a fulfilling life, a productive career, and it's not just about income. It's about flexibility. It's about opportunity, and that's something that it seems like we're in the moment where this could be so much more available. The technology that we have, the ability for people to work flexibly, to do an interview like this, anywhere around the world, not in a particular studio. These kind of things allow us so much flexibility, and yet workplaces are sort of focused, in something that kind of happened more than a half a century ago in terms of these brick and mortar ideas that everybody has to work in a certain place in a certain way.
Isn't it interesting, right? Because we're going through an election, not that I want to get all political, and I know that AFP is not a partisan organization, but one of the things we're talking about are competing visions for America. And one of the accusations, there's an organization out there that has created a massive policy agenda that I won't name by name, but we've all heard about it. And one of the knocks on it from the detractors is that it takes us back to a certain period of time, right? It takes us back to X or Y or Z. It's a vision of America from the 70s or 60s or 50s or what have you. But isn't it true, Austen, that when we talk about employment law, and this kind of dovetails into the issues of so-called good, I will use air quotes, good jobs, that the folks who are pushing back on trying to find some kind of new way of pushing forward on labor and employment, that they are trying to take us back to a period of time, the relationship between employers and employees that really harkens back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's this notion that we all work in factories and we all have local jobs, and those businesses stay in place, and we start one place in our careers and we work our way up the ladder in that one place, almost as a rite of passage. Like it's not some kind of dynamic marketplace. But as we know, there's so much more diversity now in the workplace, where people can work. People change careers as quickly as they change their favorite restaurant or anything else in society. And that's something that can be looked at negatively, or it can be taken advantage of. And we find ways for people to flourish in this diverse world with a lot of technology and opportunities. But yes, the policies, a lot of stuff was built around the idea of everybody being unionized in their workplace. And the National Labor Relations Act from back from 1935, and the recent decades right after that, where a lot of the employment policies that govern us today were put in place, and they don't fit this idea where people can be flexible anymore. And there's rules and regulations, I think, that are trying to bring us back to that era as if we have that stability, but it's not responding to the market that we actually have.
Is that where, I mean, let me spitball here a little bit. So when the administration talks about so-called good jobs, what they really mean are jobs that are unionized or can be unionized. Isn't that right?
Yes, it's not me just describing that as an insinuation, but it's directly laid out. There's a lot of resources through the Department of Labor when they discuss good jobs. There's a lot of worker organizing resources. And there is this idea, if you have a large business, they can impose top-down regulations on what they want a workplace to look like. And they envision that unions are going to essentially be the negotiator at all those workplaces. If you go across what the Good Jobs Initiative shows, most of the examples they have, in fact, all the examples they have some sort of taxpayer investment into a workplace, utilizing government labor, and then providing some of that money to interest groups like unions to help carry out those projects. There aren't examples of any upstart business, small business, or even for that matter, any private sector business that isn't unionized. And that's something that I've kind of shared as a concern here is it's not an economy driven by the users within the economy, by the workers, by we, the American workers. We think we have a good sense of when we have a good job or not. People may be aspiring to the next job, regardless what their current job is right now. But the administration has a vision, as noted, that there's a certain way to work and that they can sort of dictate from top down what your pay is going to look like, what your exact schedules and everything can be managed, rather than allowing us to be different. Even in the same workplace, we can all be more productive by having some differences from one worker to the next and what their needs are.
One can draw the parallel to, and I'm not raising a conspiracy theory of the Chinese Communist Party influence here, because that wouldn't be fair. But on the other hand, there is certainly a remarkable similarity with this idea of we're going to have everybody live, we're going to have them move away from rural situations into cities. We're going to get them out of their cars and into government-run transit systems where folks commute on the schedules that we want them to, into jobs in which the government sets the wages and they set the working hours and they set whether or not you are affiliated with a union. I mean, am I far-fetched here, Austen?
No, there's a vision that way, and I've focused all of my time, it seems, on a common theme that I just like to say is flexible work. There's
right.
a really an opportunity, again, where the workers themselves have greater say. Those who are self-employed, actually the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so an actual government survey, showed 9 out of 10 of them preferred that work and would never go back to traditional employment if they could.
Well, right. Then the irony, of course, is that, in at least in the DC area, so many government workers who may very well be a part of the union, so much of them are on this kind of flex time schedule, right? They have to put in their 40 hours of work, and they can do it when they want, obviously within reason, but they can work 10 hours a day for 4 days a week and then, every other week have a 4-day weekend. But the federal government would seem to, or the labor unions, et cetera, they would seem to be pushing back against this for everybody else. Or am I reading this wrong?
You're right. In fact, there's legislation that it surprises me we haven't been able to get bipartisan acceptance and make it law, because it would dictate for the private sector something that the federal government gets. You're alluding to this.
Yeah.
There's legislation called the Working Families Flexibility Act. It merely allows people who work overtime to choose between accumulating paid leave or getting paid extra. Instead of time and a half paid, right, you could have time and a half vacation, which is what allows federal workers a lot of flexibility. Somebody would love that. They would say, I'd love to have 2 days off next week, to do something with my family. And I know it's a busy week at the workplace. Can I put some extra time in? So there's ways to create solutions, even in the current paradigm of what the workplace looks like right now, that would take very minor tweaks and improve things significantly.
Austen, is it as simple as, right, listen, I'm a big fan of Hanlon's razor. I don't know if you're familiar with that axiom, which is to say, never attribute to malice that which can just as easily be attributed to stupidity. And is it that they want to control us, or they want to control workers and the workforce and the benefits that then accrue to unions? Or is it as simple as they think we're too stupid to decide for themselves? Or is it a combination of both?
Well, I won't eliminate an important aspect, which is there is politics involved. There is political support to interest groups like unions, that the Democratic Party or center left, I should say, in a general sense, seems to align with more. But I think if you're looking at this from the most positive perspective, there is this belief that they can help secure a great workplace for everyone by having these mandates, but it just doesn't allow businesses the flexibility to survive. They can't run a large national debt like our federal government. They have to provide goods and services that meet the demand right now in order to move forward. And workers themselves, they can't work every job and in every situation due to family needs and other things that pop up. And yet we have all of these barriers to just that flexibility, that contract freedom that actually would provide a lot of solutions. When you have that top-down approach, certain businesses just can't survive it. And that's, it kind of creates this need. There's nothing wrong with a large business. That's, but what a lot of business, leaders aspire to have when they have a growing business. But this idea that, large businesses are sort of, they become almost like an agency of the government where they can impose their red tape, things that are difficult for a business to go by unless they're large enough to, have a large enough staff and a large enough legal team and a large enough accountants to meet the needs of the federal government just to do business.
When I was a small business lobbyist, regulatory affairs lobbyist, I would always get nervous when big business and big labor and big government would get together to push something, because I knew deep down inside that what they were really doing, the big business was a part of it, because they knew they could absorb the regulatory costs and use it as a cudgel for competition, to drive their smaller businesses out of the marketplace. Talk about the last couple of years of Biden labor regulatory policy, labor regulatory policy, and how that has impacted small businesses. I know what's going on the aggregate, right? I've run the numbers. A lot of our colleagues have run the numbers. We know the regulatory state has grown by 50% in the aggregate, measurement in terms of the cost of regulations. I know what it's done specifically to businesses in terms of those cost numbers, but in terms of behavior, how are businesses reacting? What has it done to small business formation and the numbers of businesses closing? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there has been a drop in recent years in small business formation. I think it's picking up to some degree because there's such a demand for self-employment. But pushing against that are a lot of policies right now that are being implemented, which certainly creates a lot of uncertainty. That's why there's a bad economic outlook amongst individuals and businesses when they're surveyed. They don't feel good about the future because they know that whatever they're doing to survive inflation right now doesn't ensure them that they're going to be successful later. The Biden administration, the National Labor Relations Board, has put out a number of rulings and regulations that really try to slant each workplace towards union organization. There was a decision called a CMEX decision. This actually, in many instances, threatens to take away secret ballots for workers, for instance. This idea that you can, the whole notion is if you're a worker, you want to have a good conscience about what you're supporting or not. Same way you want privacy and who you vote for with your elected officials.
Right.
Unions have ability to go out to your workplace, also follow you at home, get your contact information, and put a lot of pressure on you to support a union. You can rely on a secret ballot in the end to say yes or no to a union. And yet this decision really puts a lot of pressure on businesses to try to handle this matter and sort of have to fight unionization rather than just letting workers have that final say. There's an independent contractor regulation at the Department of Labor.
This is what I want to talk about,
Acting Secretary Julie Su, who, by the way, it still hasn't been confirmed, but now for well over a year is sort of the official Secretary of Labor that's going out and promoting this Good Jobs Initiative, or so-called Good Jobs Initiative. But her state of California implemented an ABC test.
Oh, yeah.
And it's dropped employment significantly in the industries where a lot of self-employed workers were. And really, California has one of the worst unemployment rates and a higher poverty rate in a lot of places because of their high cost of living and people not being able to meet those needs. People have migrated out of the state to try to continue their careers. And now they're trying to implement that at the federal level with the regulation, coming as far as they could with their regulatory authority. So it may not look like an ABC test necessarily by the wording, but they've gone as far as they can with it. And there's 65 million people who now freelance every year. It's a rising number.
Oh, yeah.
Whether that's full-time or somebody who does just for, some side income. We're talking a huge chunk of our economy that's impacted and potentially, faces a barrier to continuing in the future.
Just so my listeners understand this and viewers understand this, explain why it's not a one-to-one proposition, right? You get the uninitiated out there who would say, well, all they're doing is saying that instead of being independent contractors, they now have to be employees. It won't change anything. It just means that there are certain other rules that need to follow. But it's not a one-to-one thing. There is drop-off between independent contracting and employment. Explain why.
Yeah, well, every workplace has certain things that need to be filled in terms of roles, but not all of those roles are intended to be permanent roles. You may not need a photographer on each occasion if you're some sort of venue. If you're if you're a restaurant and you want to have live music, you can't employ a musician full time. You bring people in, they do gigs. If you need some legal help, a small business isn't going to afford a lawyer for a full-time salary, 365 days a year. They're going to bring in somebody to help perform a task for them. This flexibility allows businesses to lean into the expertise of workers for something they don't need full-time and couldn't afford full time. And on the other end, these workers, some of them choose, to leave the workplace because they can't find the employment they need or that they wanted if they're not allowed to be independent. You'll even see it in a lot of delivery services. Well, there's truckers, you can't necessarily have a business that delivers to a different part of the country and then has a business to bring something, goods back across the country to where that driver is. But as an independent contractor, they work for different companies and say, I can fill my truck up for this business. And then when I drive across 10 states and drop it off, I actually don't have to drive home empty-handed, but there's another business that needs my services. So it creates enormous flexibility, not only for the workers, but for the businesses. And most people are satisfied with this arrangement and in fact prefer it. And businesses thrive as well. They work with one another, and we lose that as these regulations come on board.
Listen, I am, I'm someone who literally, as I counted up, I have 3-4 gigs. Maybe I shouldn't be admitting that on the air, but again, there's a certain degree of flexibility that I love in being able to do both the policy work that I do and the media and the variety of policy work that I do and the media work that I do. So I certainly empathize with that, being out of the traditional, employer-employee mindset. Let's talk about sort of real quick before I let you go, and because I also want to talk about sort of your outside interests. The issue of back-end unionization of things like home childcare workers. I don't know if are you familiar with that at all? Can you talk about that at all?
I can. I've definitely followed it over the years.
Yeah. This is part and parcel of it, but talk about how the government is trying to force unionization on people who don't want to be unionized in these non-traditional businesses. And then what that does to the economy, because there's an economic cost that is there as well. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So you brought up the home care workers. There are other instances of this, but this is a particularly telling one. In a lot of states, basically governors or other special interests come together with different agencies or governors, and they've created situations where they do what you basically would call stealth unionization. They choose an industry, and in this instance, a lot of home care workers, sometimes even people taking care of their own disabled family members, they receive funding. The client receives funding maybe from the government through a Medicaid type service, let's say, but then a lot of private, of course, contributions come to it as well. But they've done situations where they did mail-in unionization ballots. Most workers weren't aware of that this existed, and yet a majority of people who participated said yes. And all of a sudden, agencies were recognizing this union. And so you could have a disabled child that is in such a state that you can't work regular hours and you're a full-time caretaker. You have to pay the union part of the money that should be assisting that child, and that helps your family get by, just as a mandate. And that has happened. There have been rollbacks in some instances where the effort was by interest groups to make these public sector employees. Yes. So imagine being a private worker, whether you work for a home healthcare agency or an individual as an independent contractor, or you're taking care of your own individual. The notion was, because your client is paying you with money that may be some sort of healthcare assistance, somehow it's almost like you're being paid by the public sector. Right. Therefore, you're a public employee. So these are things unions have done. They've forged signatures at times to show that people are in a union who had no awareness of it. And so this is something that happens in certain places where the interest is high enough to gain political support from unions. And that's the problem. Americans for Prosperity wants unions to have freedom of association and freedom of speech just as we do. And that's often what we say. They should operate like us. Sure. That means voluntary membership. And sure, you can bring your case to the public and try to say, this is what we advocate for. There's nothing wrong at all with that. But a lot of it is forced on workers, and it's forced on businesses. And in the public sector, it's forced on voters. All of a sudden, the government that they elect is no longer accountable to them, but it's accountable to an interest group. Sure. And that interest group isn't the workers. It's a special interest that now controls the workers.
And that has a vested financial interest in making sure that the regulations are as tight enough so that they are people are forced to support them, literally they're forced to take money out of their pockets to give to them. So tell us a little bit about AFP. You may be my first Americans for Prosperity guest on. How long have you been there? What does AFP do?
Yes, I've been with Americans for Prosperity since 2019. We're a grassroots organization that has millions of contributors around America voluntarily, and we have staff in a majority of states around America. And so we work at the federal and state levels. We're really trying to help people realize their potential, trying to uphold the ideas of a free society, making sure that government is accountable to us, making sure that we control our own destiny. And so we work across a full range of issues. I happen to work in the employment space, and that means, again, working at regulations that exist at the federal level, major union policies, other sort of mandates and regulations. We also work at the state level, where I try to get rid of employment barriers like occupational licensing laws, which essentially is a government permission slip just to work in an industry.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you and the person that wants to pay for your service are completely satisfied. You still have to go through many onerous requirements just in order to provide something.
Right.
And they don't have a health and safety return, for instance, which is always the argument that we're all in grave danger. Many jobs that are more dangerous don't require licensure, but where there's a special interest, they've created one.
One of my favorite examples was up in Maryland. The woman who, and the good folks, I think, at the Institute for Justice represented her. She wanted to do equine massage. So she wanted to massage horses. And, the vet said, or the state said she needed a massage license, but the massage guild wouldn't give her a license because she wasn't massaging humans. They said she needed a veterinarian's license. The vet said she didn't need a vet license because she wasn't practicing veterinary medicine. And I think eventually the IJ challenged, and she was able to finally get her wish to simply massage horses without having to go through some agency. So let me ask you this. And I talk about this. I've been talking about this now that I've been doing this show for almost 2 years. I was originally thinking about doing a show called Outside Interests, in which folks who are involved in politics and policy, in order to sort of demystify who they are and the work that they do, talk a little bit about what they do when they're not doing this kind of work. And I know I'm throwing a curveball at you, Austen, but what are some of your outside interests when you're not doing this important work? What are you up to?
Yeah, well, I have a 9 and 7-year-old, so a lot of times they're dictating what my personal life looks like. But they're well rewarding for me and my wife. We do spend a lot of time doing that. We actually started homeschooling with them during the pandemic era, when there was, of course, many disruptions with schooling, and it happened to be when our son was starting kindergarten. At that point, we actually got a little bit of joy out of it. My wife got a lot of fulfillment in doing that, and we have great networks with that. We watch sports, we play a lot of sports, we do music activities with the children, and I do like my job.
What sports are you guys particularly interested in?
Yeah, we had my son playing baseball, which was my own sport of interest growing up, but he switched to soccer. Okay. They keep him running, so he plays on a travel soccer team. They both do swim team. They do other recreational sports like basketball in certain seasons, but we keep them active. As we say, we do the homeschooling, so this is great networking for them to meet people and still live a very kind of normal and thriving life, and we travel when we can. But we love it.
What position did you play?
I was typically a left fielder.
Nice. All right.
Little league, I played a lot of infield, but I tended to have a great glove and then have a very questionable throw to first base.
Oh boy.
Outfield, you have a little leeway. So I went out there and said, you know what, I'm safer out here with my throws. So
we can definitely say that Austen Bannan comes out of left field.
I think so. I think.
How do folks find out more about the good work you're doing for AFP?
Yes. So we have americansforprosperity.org. You can see work of mine there. We do actually have other projects, and we create websites at times. I do recommend you check them out. We have one, Bidenomics.com.
Excellent.
Which is sort of pointing out some of the harms we think, why we have so much inflation right now. It's not just President Biden, but it's a lot of people who subscribe to this extra intervention, kind of large government spending. We also have prosperityispossible.com. We don't want to just talk about the negatives of Bidenomics, but we want to show a vision of what we think is possible in America. It's a lot of what we have that we're trying to preserve, but there's ways we can improve it. So these are, a lot of places you can find it. And certainly, coming out to make an appearance like I did with you today, we'll continue to bring
Absolutely.
the word out.
No, it's great. And my guest has been Austen Bannan. He is a policy fellow in labor and employment policy issues with Americans for Prosperity. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And as I've said, please like, subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube, take a listen to us on the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, check us out on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody. And please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream